Before we begin, please be aware that today's episode includes a discussion on gender-based violence. Some listeners may find this content distressing. We encourage you to take care of yourself as you listen, and feel free to pause or skip this episode if needed. Welcome to the Good Employment Chatter podcast. Today we have a very special guest on the podcast, particularly as we're recording this during Good Employment Week, which is focused on equality issues. I'm delighted to be joined by a fellow exiled Scot, Kate Green, who's been Deputy Mayor of Greater Manchester for Safer and Stronger Communities since 2023. Kate has also previously served as a well-respected Member of Parliament for Stretford and Umston between 2010 and 2022. Kate, thanks for finding the time from, I'm sure, is a very busy diary to join with us today. It's great to have you here.
It's great to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Kate, first of all, let's give our listeners a little insight into what your role as a deputy mayor is. Can you give us some clues to what you do on a daily basis?
I'm appointed by Andy Burnham, the Mayor of Greater Manchester, to carry out the functions he has, statutory functions he has as the Police, Crime and Fire Commissioner for Greater Manchester. So I oversee, scrutinise, hold to account Greater Manchester Police, Greater Manchester Fire and Rescue Service. I also prepare for the Mayor the Standing Together and the Fire Plan. So that's our police and crime plan and our fire plan for each mayoral term. So we're just working on those new plans now following Andy's re-election back in May. I'm also very much involved in the commissioning of and the supporting of work with a whole range of partners to deliver on some of our priorities to keep people in Greater Manchester safe. So, for example, I chair our Gender-Based Violence Board, and we run a number of programmes to ensure that nobody suffers violence and abuse on grounds of gender. And we'll talk about some of that, I think, today, Ian.
No, absolutely. That's what we want to talk about. Okay.
I'm also responsible for our violence reduction unit. That's something that I know many people will have real interest in Greater Manchester, and I'm pleased to say we are seeing violent crime and knife crime reducing in some across the city. I'm also responsible for some of the programs we run to help young people develop and achieve their full potential. So, for example, we've got cadet programs in both police and fire services. We've got the apprenticeships for both police and fire services. We're very supportive of and engaged with the Mayor's Greater Manchester Baccalaureate, offering new pathways for young people towards the great jobs that they could do in the city, region and future. And all of this, we know, really helps to give people a sense of hope, a sense of excitement, contributes to this being a great place to live and to visit and to work in. And it also helps keep us all safer.
Absolutely. No, what a wonderful portfolio. It must keep you very busy. And a lot of operational stuff in there as well.
Yes, so I'm not responsible for running anything, thank goodness, but overseeing the police service and the fire service, and the chief constable has operational independence to make decisions about how he runs policing in Greater Manchester. The chief fire officer similarly has all the day-to-day operational responsibility of GMFRS.
Fantastic. So we'll get on to gender-based violence because that's what we want to talk about. But all of those things, Kate, that you mentioned there, relate to employers in the city, because the employers that we engage with most definitely want to make this one of the best places to live and work. But a little bit more about yourself, which is always interesting for our guests, is about their experiences of work. And we always like to probe about your first ever job and, what did that teach you about the world of, employment?
I've always really wanted to work, actually. We've got a ridiculously overdeveloped work ethic in my family. But I really find it so much about my sense of myself. When it's good work, it's exciting, it's rewarding. It really gives you a purpose, achievement, and a great set of social contacts as well. My very first job was a Saturday job while I was studying. And I was working in a delicatessen on Saturdays to have a bit of extra pocket money, really, money to spend on myself and save up for some of the things I wanted. In some ways, that was a great job. I was encouraged to test the merchandise. So I ate an awful lot of cheese in the time I worked in that shop. But it was hard work, physically quite hard. You'd be surprised how heavy a cheese is to lift. And some of it, I now look back and think, I don't think it would be like this today. This is a long, long time ago. But things like the knives, the meat slicing machine, there was a guard on it, but really, should I have been using that?
Yeah.
Was I entirely safe?
Yeah, you probably weren't of the age. I think there's a certain age before you're allowed
I'm
to
sure
use
there is.
those machines. And what about relationships at work? I mean, how were you managed? Was it a good, positive experience?
I can't really remember a lot about that, which might be a good thing.
Yeah.
I certainly don't remember having any major falling outs in that job. I can remember one job I did much later on when I was well into my 20s, but still a young worker.
Yeah.
Again, I look back and I say I was bullied.
Yeah.
This was a very angry man who clearly resented having a young graduate in the office. And I look back now and I think that behaviour was intolerable,
Sure.
but there was no sense I had of a mechanism for me to question it, challenge it, ask for support.
Thank goodness things have moved on a bit.
A lot,
bit.
I think.
Well, yes. I mean, we use the line that, good work is life-changing. And I often ask rooms, who's had a bad job? And many hands go up.
Yeah.
But fortunately, many people say, yes, I have had a good job, and it is life-changing.
I've had some wonderful jobs, including the one I do now,
Of
which
course.
is a fantastic, real privilege and really interesting job, working with great colleagues. The mayor's obviously a really wonderful person to work with, but I have such fabulous officials working with me, giving me advice. I'm incredibly lucky to do this job.
Yeah, to bounce out of bed in the morning knowing you're doing something that's making a difference makes a huge difference to you personally and your mental well-being, etc., doesn't it?
does.
So let's get on to the subject of our main subject of discussion around gender-based violence. So can you tell us, Kate, why gender-based violence is important for Greater Manchester, particularly Greater Manchester employers, and how big's the problem? What's the extent of the problem?
Well, we all want to be safe. We all want to be treated with respect and with courtesy and kindness in every aspect of our day-to-day lives, whether that's in our private life, in our professional life, at work, at home, when we're out and about. And for a lot of the time, a lot of us are treated really well by the people we come into contact with. But we do know that people suffer harassment and abuse because of their gender, whether that's it could be because you're a woman or because you're in a same-sex relationship. It could be because you're a transgender person. It could be all sorts of reasons why your gender becomes the reason that you experience this bullying, abuse, sometimes violence. We have a 10-year plan in Greater Manchester, a strategy to address gender-based violence in all its forms. And we are running a number of work streams recognising the different ways in which it can be experienced. So, for example, the Mayor has championed the Is This OK campaign, which encourages men and boys to call out harassment, abuse when women are out and about in public spaces. We are funding big pieces of work around teaching young people in schools about respectful relationships and about how to be safe online, because quite a lot of gender-based abuse is happening online or is being used to groom young people so that they start online, but it then becomes physical abuse. We have an important programme running with our public transport network. We work very closely with Transport for Greater Manchester and with Greater Manchester Police. We've just launched the GMP Transport live chat. So if you're travelling on the tram or a bus, you feel you're being harassed, you want to report it to GMP, but you don't want to get your phone out and call them because that'll just make the situation even worse. You can message them and they'll have a live conversation with you, and you can do that quietly and not be noticed doing that. So the transport piece is really important to us. And now, and I know this is what we want to talk a lot about today, we're starting a new programme of work with employers to say gender-based violence and abuse does happen in the workplace.
Yeah.
Equally, the workplace may be your safe space.
Sure.
And so we think there's a lot of potential in working with employers as partners across the city region.
Absolutely. And we saw some of that during COVID, didn't we? And the need for safe spaces and that whole home working place piece, particularly not just around mental health and well-being, but physical violence as well.
Yeah, to start with, we thought that the volumes of domestic abuse were falling. That was because it was hidden away.
Sure.
People were shut away in their homes. The usual way in which friends might notice, family members might notice something's not right here. The sense of it being something that they had somewhere to go and talk about. And the fact that they were spending all that time in close proximity with other members of the household actually meant that over time we realised there was more abuse going on behind closed doors during COVID, and that's very worrying.
How interesting. That, you must have thought when the numbers went down, oh, that's not right. Yeah, absolutely. So what steps can employers take to create a safe and confidential reporting system for incidents of gender-based violence?
Let's start by thinking about gender-based violence in the workplace. You're being harassed at work.
Sure.
I'd expect all good employers to have very clear policies and processes in place. If that's happening to you, who can you confide in? What's the reporting arrangement that's in place? How do you seek support from your employer? And how do you know that you'll be taken seriously when you make a complaint that you're being abused? It could be a workmate. For particularly customer-facing businesses, it may be that it's your customers that are abusive, and we absolutely would expect employers to stand by their staff and not allow that abuse and harassment to be experienced from customers or from anyone that is being provided a service by the business. We would also expect that confidentiality is respected. There's a lot of stigma attached to reporting gender-based abuse. It goes to your sense of identity, your sense of self. And whilst it's really important that there are places where it can be reported and properly investigated, and that employers have really good policies and processes in place for that, it's also really important that the person who's experiencing the abuse has their confidentiality protected and that they know they'll be taken seriously.
Sure. That psychological safety piece covers a lot of elements in the workplace right now, and I think it's something that's coming forward. We talk a lot about disclosure of disability, autism, for instance, and so it's a similar kind of approach that's needed.
It is. It's also similar to the approach that the police will use, for example, if they're investigating an allegation of sexual or domestic abuse, which is to say, we'll be victim-led, suspect-focused. The problem is not the person experiencing the abuse, it's the person causing it. But we will move in the way and at the pace that the person who's experiencing the abuse wants to move at. And that's really important because you might not feel confident about pursuing a particular route to deal with the abuse. You might feel that makes you more vulnerable or more exposed. It's very important we keep people safe and that we assure them that they'll be kept safe. But a lot of that is also about saying, how can we keep you safe? You tell us what it is you need.
Yeah, that stigma piece is really important to protect, isn't it? Absolutely. And in terms of the customer abuse, do I understand that the Labour government might be bringing in an offence in the retail sector?
Well, there's quite a lot of discussion going on around protecting workers, retail workers, from abuse, in the same way as we have protection, quite rightly, for public sector workers, blue light workers and so on. If they experience abuse or violence, then that's a specific offence with consequential penalties for that kind of behaviour. There's been a long-running campaign supported by Usdaw, the Shop Workers Union in particular. I should declare an interest here. I'm a member of Usdaw, and they've been great supporters of me as a politician. But this is a campaign that I think has really widespread support. I think the public are very solidly behind it too. Many years in the making to try to get a succession of governments to legislate to recognise that specific offence of abuse against a retail worker. And yes, the Labour government that's recently taken office, I believe, is committed to introducing that legislation.
Yeah, that's good. And today, actually, coincidentally, the Employment Rights Bill gets laid at Parliament.
And that's a really interesting piece of legislation and fascinating to listen to the debate about it, and particularly the concerns that smaller employers have. But I don't think I would want any employer who didn't want to keep their staff safe at work, to do all they could to support them when they're vulnerable and in a dangerous situation. And it makes good business sense.
Of course it does.
There's a huge cost to the economy and to business if you've got staff in your workforce who are experiencing gender-based violence, either at work or outside of work. It's going to affect their performance, their attendance, their health. The sick pay budget will go up. So there's a big business imperative to ensure that workers are safe and have the right to be safe.
Oh, absolutely. And we are viewing the Employment Rights Bill as a really welcome thing, of course. but we also see it as the building blocks that we've been working on for years, to be honest. And we need to, in Manchester, push further and harder on some of those aspects, particularly around equality. So in terms of gender-based violence, what role do you think leadership should play in an organisation, particularly in terms of the kind of culture that's set? And then we always focus on middle managers and how middle managers manage people is so crucial in this. Can we support them?
Yeah, it sets the tone, doesn't it? It's what comes from the top.
Yeah.
One of my best examples is actually the Greater Manchester Fire and Rescue Service. The Chief Fire Officer has been absolutely steadfast and crystal clear that the most important priority for him is the culture of the organisation. It's culture first in Greater Manchester Fire and Rescue. And he took that line from the very first day he walked into the Fire and Rescue Service, but it became all the more relevant when we began to see at the beginning of last year a number of complaints of misogyny, abuse, racism, homophobia in certain WhatsApp groups and so on. And he's also absolutely clear that that's not going to be tolerated in the service, and if that's your behaviour, you'll be out. Dave Russell, the Chief Fire Officer, starts every meeting, a board meeting, an internal steering group meeting, whatever it is, with let's talk about the culture piece first. What are we doing in relation to whatever it is they're discussing about culture? What are we doing to support and nurture a diverse workforce? Safety is, of course, massively important. It's ingrained in the culture of a fire and rescue service. So to the point of feeling safe at work, the gender-based violence and the sense of dignity and rights and respect at work are a really important piece of the way Dave thinks about and talks about his culture first.
I think we should get
approach.
Dave on the podcast.
You
perhaps.
should get Dave. Dave is doing something amazing. We brought the Fire Minister up from the Home Office the other day to look at what they're doing, and I'm so proud of it. If you ask people in the Fire and Rescue Service, they know this is Dave's top priority. They're taught about it from the moment they walk through the door. A new recruit hears about it in the very first few days
Wonderful.
in GMFRS. And so that tone from the top is made real. It's not just we think the chief cares about this. He actually embeds it into the way that the operation is run. When you get down, and this is true in all organisations, isn't it? When you get down the sort of hierarchy of leadership, you're absolutely right. That supervisory level is so, so important. And they've got to believe, therefore, that the message from the top is authentic.
Yep.
You've got to walk the walk as well as talk the talk.
Of course.
You've also, I think, got to equip and train those supervisors so that they can be confident in really inculcating that culture, those values, and being confident about calling out behaviour when they see that it doesn't meet the standards that are expected. That's a tough thing to do.
Yeah.
We've got some quite young supervisors in our different businesses, haven't we, across Greater Manchester? Sometimes challenging people who may have been in the workplace a lot longer than they have, may have grown up with different attitudes at different times. It's really important, therefore, that we have a training programme in place for supervisors so that they can be sure about how to call out unacceptable behaviour, support people to change, because nobody really wants to be abusive and unpleasant and disliked by their colleagues. But also, I think there is something about peer support, isn't there? And really giving everybody in the workplace a sense that calling out violence, abuse, harassment is everybody's business.
And that's something that I think we can help with. We have lots of peer support across all the organisations of all scales and sizes and sectors. We learn as much from the small business as a large business. So we will help in that discussion and peer support for sure. We talked at the beginning about all genders and all vulnerable groups, and people will look at this as a misogynistic agenda, but it's not, is it, Kate? It's not just that.
No, it's not. So we look, for example, at homophobia, at the discrimination and abuse, prejudice that transgender people experience. We recognise that often gender-based abuse may sit alongside other characteristics that are driving the abuse. So, for example, racism can sit alongside the gender-based abuse. Disability, as you mentioned earlier, and particularly some of the so-called hidden disabilities. Again, we can see that can really lead to abuse, and it's incredibly painful and hurtful for the person experiencing it.
Absolutely. So this isn't just a one-eyed agenda. It definitely is cutting right across the equality, diversity and inclusion approach. So the Employment's Right Bill, which we've talked about, do you think for gender-based violence we need some stronger legal basis for action?
So I think I'm right in saying the government have now introduced a new duty on employers to prevent sexual harassment, and that's sort of supported under the Equality Act. Legislation, guidance, statutory guidance, duties are all helpful in sending a message, aren't they? But I think more important is that we support and inform employers to know how to do this really well, give them the tools, the materials, the resources to do this really well. The vast, vast majority of employers in Greater Manchester, I am absolutely sure, want to be and are good employers. And this might be a new area for some of them to be thinking about, because it is relatively recently that it's come to be talked about in an employment context. But I think that there'll be a lot of goodwill. We know we've got the support of the Greater Manchester Chamber of Commerce, for example, to do this. I think there'll be a lot of goodwill from employers, and we can support and equip them. I should say, Ian, that I've made it really clear that we need some champions, employers who want to go out early and work with us on this. But it's really important to me that one of those pioneering employers is the Greater Manchester Combined Authority. I can't be asking other employers to do it if I haven't put my own house in order. Of course.
No, absolutely. Tell me about how we measure, Kate. So an employer has a policy, they have action, they've informed, they've trained. How do they measure the impact of that?
Staff surveys are really good, aren't they? Really easier in bigger organisations because you can protect the anonymity. You've got the capacity to set up the survey, analyse the data, make a plan on the basis of what it tells you. More difficult, I absolutely recognise, if you're a much smaller organisation. But on the other hand, if you're a much smaller organisation, the boss is going to be closer to the coalface, to the workers, and just the what we used to call in the old days management by walking about. Do they still call it that, Ian?
Well, yes, they do. Okay. They still do it. See it.
Being accessible, being available, having your employers know that your employees know that you're around, that you want to be talked to, you want to hear what's going on. And I think that informal, an employer or a boss will pick up a sense of, well, this is going quite well. People are talking about it. It's being discussed in the tea room or whatever it is. That informal evidence is important. Measuring it, I mean, there are all sorts of proxies, aren't there? You can look at things like staff absence. You can look at things like performance and productivity. I would say that's a difficult line to connect, but all these proxies tell you you're in a good workplace, don't they?
They do, but they probably
retention, I guess, would be the other.
And if they go wrong, then there should be indicators to the managers to think, why is that happening?
Yeah.
Why is the behaviour changed? Why you got this sick pattern? So I know that many employers rely on employee assistance programs. To support staff through all sorts of walks of life. What role do you think they have in this agenda, Kate?
I think they're important because they offer that confidentiality. It's distant. You might not want to tell your manager about all of this. You might very well not want it to be known by colleagues. So that distance to an employee assistance program that might be provided by a third party can be very important for that confidence and that sense of confidentiality and privacy. I think it's really important employees know that they're there, how to access them, believe that they're for real. So I think they've got a lot of potential actually in this space, and we'll be very interested to hear from employers in Greater Manchester who've got those schemes in place to come and talk to us about whether there's more work I could be doing from my office to embed some of what we want to achieve around gender-based violence and the role of employers more clearly in those employee assistance programs.
So I know we've worked together with your team and identified some employers that are working with you now. Have you got examples of some really good practice, Kate, that you could share?
Yeah, so, I mean, there are some really great employers out there. Lloyds Bank is one we're working with, Lloyds Banking Group. Kellogg's is another, famously a great employer in just up the road from my home in Stretford.
Of course.
And in the public sector, the NHS, in the charity sector, Talk, Listen, Change, they're some of the early pioneers that we're kind of working with. Things that they can do. Apart from some of the things we've been talking about, clear information for employees about where to get support, who they can go to, how to report, how to whistleblow, but also things like, if it's helpful, adjusting start and finish times, perhaps thinking about supporting an employee to think about their route to work if they're concerned about perhaps stalking or harassment.
Sure.
And where a regular journey pattern is a bit of a gift to your abuser because they can see when you might be moving around,
Sure.
and particularly when you might be on your own. So things about working patterns, transport, perhaps being more flexible about working from home, if that makes an employee feel safer than perhaps having to go out and about. Some of the really good employers we're working with are already doing that. And I would also say, I think both Kellogg's and Lloyds Banking Group offering time off, paid leave, recognised in the same as parental leave is recognised, or bereavement leave might be recognised. That leave for somebody who's having to perhaps move house because they've experienced domestic abuse, or just need that time because they've become a victim to kind of recover and sort out how they want to change or perhaps exit the situation.
Yeah, we do have an employer that we've worked with for a long time now. They've got one value, and that's life happens.
That
which
does
is,
happen.
which is lovely.
It's true.
And it kind of accommodates anything that happens. And, you know, that everyone goes through different phases in their life, and it reflects in the workplace. And if the employer can accommodate and support through those different phases, including this one, then, you know, what a really good sign to the employee that they care.
Yeah.
And I think, you know, that culture piece, I'd love to get your take on this, the culture piece about how they relate that management by walking round, we think is built around trust.
Yes.
More than anything. Yeah.
And a sense, therefore, that that employer or that boss cares about me as a person, doesn't just see me as a cog in the wheel, really. That sense of being cared about is very, very important to that trusting relationship, isn't it?
Yeah. Kate, it's been good to talk to you today, and it'll be great to get this message out to our listeners and the Charter community, the movement that we've created here. What more can we do together, Kate?
I hope that through all the contacts you've got and working on the Good Employment Charter, you could help bring employers to us who would really like to help us develop this initiative. It's new to us. We're learning. We're feeling our way. We recognise workplaces are all very different in size, different in the kind of work you're doing, different in terms of the working patterns of your workforce. So we'd like to have as diverse a range of employers as possible across Greater Manchester, helping us to develop models that work for all those different circumstances that people are working in. If you're interested, you know, please get in touch with us, perhaps through you.
Yeah, through us, definitely.
That would really help us to have more and more people coming on board, helping us to get better and better at this, but also then becoming the champions peer-to-peer to other employers, because nobody wants to hear a politician shouting at them. But, you know, business leaders listen to one another. And so our best champions in getting more employers on board will be employers.
Yeah. And there's some sectors that we probably could target in this. I'm thinking of hospitality, retail, perhaps the security industry, all of which we've got really good contacts with.
Absolutely. And if you think about the nature of that work, particularly hospitality, for example, security is often late at night, finishing in the small hours. Employers thinking about, well, how does my workforce go home?
Absolutely.
Have they got safe travel arrangements in place? Lots of things that we would really like to hear from employers and work with them to make Greater Manchester as safe a city region as we possibly can for everyone.
Kate, we're coming to the end of our time, so is there any last thing you want to say to the employers?
Thank you to all our employers who are really good, caring employers, and we are so excited to have the chance to work with you to put Greater Manchester yet again out in front, to be the best and the first place to do this and keep every one of our workers safe.
With our help, we will make that vision come true. Thanks so much for your insights and your call to action. You can certainly count on the Good Employment Charter community to help you and support your call to action. Thanks, Kate.
Thank you very much indeed.